Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. Today we'll be talking about lesson 14 of our study, which covers the Gospel according to John, chapter 11, verses 1 through 57. Alright, picking up from last time, where Jesus has continued this ongoing and contentious conversation with the Jewish leaders, and knowing that they are not particularly fond of him, nor do they exactly want to keep him around. He's now been, again, out of town. And while he is out of town, now we see he gets a message from some of his good friends who live close to Jerusalem. Mary and Martha and his friend Lazarus, the message being about his friend Lazarus, specifically that he is ill. As we're introducing these people, the text describes Mary in terms of something she hasn't done yet. So it can seem a little confusing. Where did she anoint Jesus' feet? I don't remember that happening yet. Was that in another gospel? It's in this gospel. It's after this. So the text seems to be assuming that that's a pretty known thing that it'll get to, but it's pre-identifying her as the person who did that, which helps frame how close she is to Jesus. So what we're really setting up is, and the important thing to know about these people right now, is that these are good friends of Jesus. Even though we have not seen them yet, and they're not actually in his group of disciples, following him around everywhere he goes, they're clearly people he's met in his ministry that he has a good, solid relationship with, which is important. And Lazarus' illness looks extremely serious, arguably fatal, which is also important. So when Jesus hears the message, what does he have to say about it? Two interesting things happen here. First, Jesus says, don't worry, this is not fatal, and it's happening so that God can be glorified. Second, he waits 2 days before he does anything about it, which will be extremely important when we see what happens. So let's keep both of those things in mind. Jesus has said, don't worry about the illness, not fatal. And then he says, we're just going to chill here for a couple days before we go deal with that, because it's nothing to worry about. So that's Jesus' response to finding out that his friend is ill. We're going to take that view of Jesus with us into what happens as we get into this whole thing, because his view will, as often is the case with God, start looking a little counterintuitive to us as we dig into seeing how events play out. And that is not at all an uncommon thing. If we're not seeing with the eyes of faith, again, the challenge of the first half of the Gospel according to John is, can you see with the eyes of faith instead of with the eyes of eyes? And things look totally different in that view. So we're going to have two different layers of things happening here. We're going to have how Jesus sees things happening, how normal people see things happening, and then where other people fall on that scale or that continuum. So leading into that and looking at that, first and foremost, we're going to see, or we frame the whole thing from Jesus' point of view. This is happening to glorify God. This is not fatal. So we'll see how that goes from here. Jesus has now decided, after waiting the requisite 2 days, for whatever reason that will become apparent eventually, that he wants to go see Lazarus. And his disciples raise the very pertinent question. That's in Judea. And in Judea, they're trying very hard to kill you. Not only in Judea, but it actually ends up being very close to Jerusalem. So that's going right into the heart of where everyone's looking to kill you. Are you sure you want to go there? Legitimate and valid concern. It's definitely within the realm of possibility that the next time Jesus gets close to Jerusalem, he's going to die. Not to spoil anything that's coming, but I think we all know some of the story, and we're getting close to, chronologically in the gospel, to when all of that plays out, although we have a lot of text left before we get there, and a lot of interesting developments on the way. And this thing that's happening here is going to be what frames and sets up all of what happens after that. So very important. And Jesus' view of the danger is just to talk about light and darkness. Don't worry, that's light for half of the day, and as long as you walk in the light part of the day, nothing bad will happen to you. So don't worry. It seems to be the thrust of his message. He doesn't say, don't worry, I'm not going to get killed. He just says, we're walking in the light, what ultimate bad thing can happen? And from that point of view, he's right. But they also have, it turns out, a very solid point that he himself is in mortal danger if he goes back in that area. So, again, two different levels of how things are working, which happens a lot in the Gospel according to John, but is especially important here. Jesus means something totally different than what they're hearing him say. What he means is, as long as we're doing the will of God, good will come out of what's happening, and we're doing the right, good thing. What they think he means is, God's going to protect me from all harm because I'm serving him. That is, it turns out, not what God means. But ultimately also, yes, exactly what he means. It turns out protecting from harm can also include harm, but coming out on the other end okay. So we're doing a thing here that Jesus knows he's doing, and everyone else fears might happen, but have decided it's not what's going on. That tension also is important to have persist through what's going on here. And that background of, it started with Jesus, your friend Lazarus might be in mortal danger, and it transitions immediately to, for Jesus to do anything about it, Jesus himself also has to be in mortal danger. So themes of life and death and danger to life go into this, and there's a contrast or a comparison, an important one, between Jesus and Lazarus that also sets up and frames this whole thing. Jesus is explicitly and deliberately going into the same kind of situation that Lazarus is in. And what Jesus said about Lazarus holds true about him as well. Don't worry, this isn't mortal danger. This is so that God might be glorified. Works on both of these levels as well. He's not just talking about Lazarus, he's also talking about himself, Jesus. So that kind of gets us set up a little bit. Let's see what happens. Here we see an interesting thing happen. Jesus has just said, right before this, don't worry, what Lazarus is suffering from is not fatal. Then he waits 2 days and he says, okay, we're going to see him, but just so you're all ready, he's asleep. And we're going to wake him up. And they say, oh, cool, no problem then. But why would you wake up an invalid when he's getting the rest that will heal him? But sure, that sounds like that's no big deal. And Jesus says, nope, wait, pause. When I say asleep, I mean he is dead. So he's dead, but we're also going to wake him up. you should think of it like sleep. He's dead, and we're going to fix that. After having previously said, not a fatal illness. How does that work? He's not going to die. He's dead. Jesus said both within the span of 10-ish verses here, and they seem contradictory. So what's going on? This sets up a critically important theme that we've been building to through this whole gospel. And we've talked some about it, but not in these terms yet. There are two different things called life and death. The one version is what the body is doing. So it can fall over and go to sleep, and it can stand back up again, be resurrected. The idea of resurrection is like it's standing up in the Greek, anastasis, standing up. And it is a description of a state of the body. Sleep, you're, prone, down, laying down, and stuck that way, right? And then resurrecting, getting up, standing back up after having been laid down. Those are physical states of a body. And we'll be talking about those things. But there is also a human being, remember, and John's Gospel relies on this, is not just a body. It is a meeting of a human body, an earthly body, with divine life from God, of a soul. And a human person is both of those, but is more the soul than the body. Which becomes critically important as we're tracing how what Jesus is doing is going to manifest and what he's doing for humanity. We'll see all that. But the body going down does not mean that the soul is dead. The states of life and death for the soul are not directly the same as the states of alive and dead for the body. And we've talked about those things being trending and directional, right? Life of the soul is a thing that is directionally moving toward not being dead. Whereas death is everything you see tends to be moving inevitably and directionally toward being not existent. Whereas things moving always toward being existing, toward being, that's life. So there's kind of this spiritual, directional, ontological state that we know Jesus is coming to help reverse for humanity that is separate but related to the state of the body. So he can say, Lazarus not dead, even when his body is going to sleep, because there's body and soul. And the state of this guy's soul, he's saying, don't worry about, which is why, again, he also describes what happens to his body as simple as sleep, because from Jesus' point of view, that's almost irrelevant to the person. He sees the person as the soul, as a thing that exists beyond and separate from the body. And that this whole sign that's about to happen is pointing us to something fundamentally important about life and death that will develop more as we go. But Jesus frames it with, this is not a thing to worry about. You call this dead, I call it asleep, and we can wake him up. This is not a big deal. Let's do a little bit of math about timelines here. So, Jesus shows up, and Lazarus has been dead for how long? 4 days. How long did Jesus wait before he left? 2 days. So, why did Jesus leave? It wasn't so that he would arrive after Lazarus was dead. If he had left immediately, that still would have been true. Right? 4 minus 2, 2. He'd have still been dead for 2 days. So why did Jesus wait? This 4 days number seems to be a very important thing for what Jesus is trying to do. There was, within Jewish thought at this time, a view that after a person went to sleep, died, again, there is a soul and a body. That's not a new thing from Jesus' point of view, that this person's spirit, breath, that's no longer in the person, because the dead person is not breathing anymore, that hangs around the person for 3 days, was their tradition. Presumably, that could have come up from the idea that someone everybody thought was dead at some point ended up not being dead and getting back up, and without science or medicine or a better way to explain it, it just got ingrained that occasionally people we think are dead aren't really dead, mostly as a result of them not really understanding when people are dead versus when people aren't. For our point of view, and what matters to this story here, is that we're looking at Jesus waits until after what people generally would have viewed as when the body and soul for sure would be separate. So he wants to wait until there's no doubt that this guy is dead. We're not going to act at a time when we think he could still be loosely alive. We're going to wait till there's absolutely no disputing, no doubt, this guy is for sure dead. Body and soul are separated. Soul is gone wherever it goes. Body is empty and dead. We want to make sure Lazarus is, by all reckoning, dead, so that nobody confuses what happens here. It's, again, why is he doing what he's doing at all? So that God can be glorified. We'll see how the sign here actually plays out, but with the logistics of how it works, it becomes also very important that it's met that criterion for dead, for everything that we're trying to set up. So, again, in order that God might be glorified and nobody second guess what's happening, Jesus had to wait till we got to that 4-day mark. So, 4 days. Setting the scene, now we point out where this is happening. Bethany, 2 miles, which is still not very far. You can walk there in a day easily from Jerusalem. So again, Jesus has gone very close to Jerusalem, and we see Lazarus apparently is connected and important enough that a number of the Jews, meaning Jewish leaders, are there in Bethany because of all of this as part of mourning. So Jesus is not coming when they're alone. Another thing that potentially could have happened if he had come 2 days sooner is he might have gotten there before a crowd. So it's also worth considering, is Jesus trying to do this in front of a crowd? And based on the way it plays out, yes, probably. But we'll see how that gets there. But framing the event, at the time Jesus comes, there is already a crowd there. That said, this initial event, he is trying to talk to these sisters before the crowd is around. So we see that as well. And Martha gets wind that Jesus is on the way and still not in Bethany at their house where everyone is, and she goes out to meet him. and has this exchange with him. As we look at Jesus' exchange with these two sisters in the Gospel according to John, two important things to think about and to look at. The first one, it's easy to come to this and to try to have in the back of our minds the Synoptic Gospels version of Jesus with Mary and Martha, where it's who's doing the work versus who's sitting at the feet of Jesus, and to have that narrative come into how we look at this one. And I urge all of us, don't do that, right? John doesn't include that account of things. And this is how he's talking about these sisters. So we should look at this here, right now. This is the important part, where we're at here. So, don't think right now about that other version of things. Look right now at this version of things. Second point, how does Jesus respond to people in the Gospels, in this Gospel? We've seen John very carefully has Jesus respond to people as they approach and meet Jesus. So we're going to see him take two very different approaches with two very different sisters. And I suggest, as we go into this, that is a response to how the sisters approach Jesus and how their grief is manifesting differently for the different sisters. And it's not Jesus being... their grief is... So let's talk about the one here. Martha. Her grief seems to be revolving around this question of why. Right? A loved one dies, you wonder, why did this happen? And you start thinking about all that, and it's easy to get into eternal views of how these things work, and all the line of thinking that she has. It'll be fine, he'll raise on the last day. Jesus has told us about that. He's not really dead. I'm holding on to my faith here to deal with this question. Why did this happen? What happens now? She's very much in her head when she's dealing with and trying to process this grief. And so how Jesus responds to her is he's responding to what is in her head. And he's helping her intellectually process, work through what this is. So that is why Jesus takes the view that he takes here, the response he makes to Martha. So what is his response? First, it's don't worry, he's not dead. So it's not a big deal. But he doesn't, of course, say it that way because he's dealing with someone in a lot of grief. But not really dead. So it's a good start. And she, with faith, responds, I know that, Lord. I agree. Yeah, he's going to rise on the last day. You've told me that, and I believe you. That doesn't make this not hard, but I believe you. It'll be fine. And Jesus responds saying, without maybe making it quite this clear, let's look again at what these life and death things are. Because again, are we thinking about standing up or lying down? Or are we thinking about alive and dead as these directional things, as this thing that I uniquely control? What are we looking at? And that's where Jesus makes this statement that actually means two different things. I am the resurrection and the life. I think if we're not paying extremely close attention to what's going on here, it's easy to conflate those two things into the same thing, right? We think of resurrection and life, same thing. No. Resurrection, again, is a body that has fallen over, able to get back up, standing up. That's resurrection. That's a thing that has happened in the Old Testament, by the way. Elijah and Elisha, at least, took people who were dead and made them not dead. in the physical, bodily sense of alive and dead. What hasn't happened anywhere, and what is completely unprecedented, is not the lying down, standing up, bodily kind of change from alive to dead, but the spiritual version of that. The version of the soul. The version that you can actually flip a switch inside of a person who is trending ever toward death and make that person instead trend toward life, always. The form of immortality, but at a spiritual, not a physical level, is life. We've talked about it previously in this gospel, is the idea of having life in yourself and sharing truly in that divine life and having that restored. That has never been given back to a person after it was lost by humanity. So resurrection, there is precedent for. This other thing is completely unprecedented. Jesus here is claiming, don't worry about it, I'm both. So yeah, you're worried about your dead brother here. And yes, you can accept there will be a time when he is resurrected again. Well, what's time? I personally am the thing that restores life to those who are dead. Both life, that entirely unprecedented thing, and as a way less big deal, anybody I want to can just stand back up again. That one is super easy compared to this other thing that, by the way, I'm also going to do. But just to make sure you all get how easy this is and what a big deal this other thing is, yeah, don't worry about it, I've got this. We're gonna handle this. Again, a sign, right? This is using the physical state as a means of pointing toward what can happen at a spiritual level as well. What can happen, what Jesus is really trying to do is to achieve the power to restore life to dead humanity. Not just to a guy who got sick and fell over and to get him back up, but to take all of humanity who has lost life at a fundamental and ontological level, and to return that as well. Now, do we think that Martha totally understands everything that Jesus has said about what's going on here? Of course not. But Jesus does lay this framework that will become clearer after the things he's about to do have happened. And so he is explaining in advance what he's going to do, then he's going to do it, and then his explanation will serve to help make clear the sign that he is, because he is doing this as a sign, not just as a miracle. It's meant to point toward this deeper thing that's happening, and it's also meant to foreshadow and initially kind of frame what's going to come later for Jesus himself as well. So we see an echo here from what happens with Lazarus to what happens with Jesus. And there are going to be a lot of similarities and a few key differences, and that will matter a lot. So Jesus meeting Martha where she is, talking through the why of what's happening, because that's where her head and her grief is at. Now we see the other sister, Mary. So Martha has her private conversation with Jesus. Then she comes back to find her sister and to send her to likewise have a conversation with Jesus. Which goes a little bit awry, unfortunately, in that people see her leaving. So she doesn't get the same encounter. So first of all, this one draws a crowd. Second of all, we talked last time about the sisters being at different places in terms of how they're dealing with and processing grief, and Jesus meeting both of them. Mary is not so much focused on the intellectual side and is clearly processing her grief emotionally rather than intellectually. So she says to Jesus the same thing: if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. And then she is weeping. And Jesus, responding to that grief, also weeps, which is an extremely interesting thing to think about. Jesus' buddy has died. Jesus always could have stopped it from happening. Jesus is nonetheless sad about it happening. How does that work? How is Jesus in this position to have allowed a thing to happen and to still be sad about it? It tells us a number of very interesting things. First one, Jesus as God can experience the human emotion of sorrow. Which, again, if you think God is all good, then you should also take away from that sorrow is not in and of itself inherently a bad thing. Which I think can be maybe a bit surprising or unusual for us to think about. That I think we associate fairly easily sorrow bad. But God, who is all good, experiencing sorrow, means it's not necessarily inherently bad. And Jesus joins with Mary in this sorrow. Also, Jesus allowed this to happen. This seems unusual and not expected, but Jesus is omniscient God in human form. All people up till this point have died, and God has literally allowed all of humanity to be in a state of mortality and death. This is not a unique condition that Lazarus is experiencing. How great must Jesus' sorrow be on account of all humanity? This is not just he's feeling for the one guy who is his friend. God loves all people and would have mourned, been sorrowful, and moved by the mortality of all people. God did not make us mortal. We made ourselves mortal when we separated ourselves from the life of God. And he wants to restore that with abundance and superabundance, to restore it in a way that we cannot so easily lose it. But in the entirety of the time, after we lost God's divine life until he gives it back to us, he is sorrowful for our fate. God himself mourns for our fate. God on earth and God in heaven is not what he wants or intends for us, his creatures. So we see in Mary's weeping, we see Jesus, God's sorrow for fallen humanity as well, but for all of humanity. And we see that in that also the explanation for Jesus coming to earth. God is here to address that, but he also allows this death thing to happen first. Why? He tells us why he allows it to happen to all of us when he tells us why he allowed it to happen to Lazarus' buddy. He allowed death in order that God might be glorified. I think I'm positive there's a mystery in that that's not so easily understood as it is said. I can say that this first period of humanity from Adam to Jesus was a thing that God did to glorify God. In what comes after, But I think wrapping our minds around that is potentially much more complex and deserves a great deal of meditation and reflection. But as Jesus intervenes here, so God intervenes in all of humanity as well. And the question everyone has here in this situation with Lazarus is the same question that we can very easily ask ourselves today. Couldn't God, who is God, have done something about this so it didn't happen this way? Couldn't God have made it not happen this way because it makes us feel bad? But that feeling bad, again, is not inherently a bad thing. What comes from that and what does it do? Our sufferings, our sorrows are not inherently things that bring about bad. In fact, good can come from them. And God can be realized in those things as much as in the joys, maybe more. And Jesus, God, shares with us in those sorrows and in bringing good out of them. There are emotional responses that are arguably less conformable with God, right? There are responses of anger and some other secondary emotions that can come up that are just inappropriate in many cases, not all. We've seen Jesus even experience zeal and anger and frustration toward what people are doing in the temple. The full gamut of human emotions is a thing that can be good. But there are manifestations and uses of those things that are also bad. But it's interesting to think God made us as creatures that are both intellectual and emotional. And it's not bad to feel sorrowful or to feel angry at an unjust situation or to feel any of the things that we feel. God made us that way and chose to share in all of those things with us. But there are ways that those things can get out of hand and be misdirected as well. So they're not inherently and necessarily good, but none of them are also inherently and necessarily bad. And Jesus shares with us in all of those things and weeps with us and for us. And so the question, couldn't Jesus have prevented Lazarus from dying? Yes. Couldn't God have prevented humanity from being in the position of mortality? Yes. So why didn't he? And Jesus' answer is, so that God may be glorified. God allows evil in order that greater good may come from it, the Catechism tells us. Here's an example. We'll see that be very true in this one concrete example. But that's also meant to be true of the greater picture of all human history. Bad things are still happening, but greater things are possible from that. God can bring good from evil. Doesn't mean God causes the evil. Jesus didn't make Lazarus die. He didn't make Adam and Eve sin. But from Lazarus' death, Adam and Eve's sin, he can bring something even better. And that's what's on display here in this sign. And it stands not only for just this guy Lazarus, but for the fate of us all. At this point, we've had enough of our anticipation. Let's get into the main event. Jesus is led to the tomb and makes a fairly unorthodox request. He says, so tomb, cave, big rock sealing off the cave, to make sure we're all visualizing the same thing, not hole in the ground with the coffin in it like we do now. Cave, rock, and corpse. And Jesus says, let's roll that rock away and open up the cave. and everybody makes the legitimate point, there's a corpse in there and it's going to be really pungent. Are you sure, Jesus, that you want to do that? So everybody's assumption here is, and they have good reason to think so, that the dead guy inside is still dead and is rotting. Because that is 100% of the time in all of their experience what happens when a person dies. And has been dead for 4 days for sure. So this is not a wrong thing for all of them to think. And Jesus is saying, yep, cool, got it, it's going to smell. Glory of God. I told you that's what we're doing, is we're about seeing the glory of God. Do you all want to see it or not? Roll away the stone. And then he prays. We don't see much in the early part of this gospel. We will see it again for an entire chapter later. Jesus' direct conversation with God. But here we do. We see, not only do we see Jesus talking to God, but importantly we see Jesus drawing everyone around him into his conversation with God. He doesn't need to say these things out loud, but he's doing something very specific and very deliberate. And he's wanting to make sure that everybody grasps that this thing happening is a result of the interchange between Jesus and God. So he thanks God for what has been done. Where have we seen that before? We saw a previous sign in the 6th chapter of this gospel at the beginning, where Jesus also worked a pretty extreme miracle, and the first thing he did was he gave thanks, and then 5 loaves and 2 fishes became all of this abundant food. Here, he thanks God, and death becomes not death. But of course, that's also, as we talked about, what that sign was about, was the scarcity of death becoming the abundance of life, ultimately. And so we're connecting to that idea in terms of Jesus giving thanks again. And once again, drawing all of the crowd into his conversation with God. And doing it in the form of thanksgiving. Jesus' public, open thanksgiving to the Father is a thing he wants all of us to join in. And so multiple times he prays thanksgiving out loud, and it's in John's Gospel. Whereas all of his other conversations with God and all of his constant and ongoing prayer, that stays between Jesus and God for now. We'll see there's going to be a shift where we're invited, some people are invited into that prayer as well. But here, what he's trying to draw all of humanity into this thanksgiving to God. So, God's going to be glorified. How do we respond to seeing the glory of God? We respond with thanksgiving. When do we respond to seeing the glory of God? In anticipation of it, before it is fully manifested. Those are things that Jesus is teaching us about the core fundamental nature of prayer. Is our prayer starts from a recognition of the power and glory of God, whether we've seen it fully manifested yet or not, and is a response of thanksgiving to that. And of course, the faith that Jesus has been talking about so much is a driving force of that. How do you recognize the glory of God when you can't yet see it? Only through the eyes of faith, which then draw us into that response of recognizing God's glory and thanking him for it. The great prayer of our church is named Thanksgiving, Eucharist. That is our encounter where we meet God His glory is manifest, and we recognize and thank him for it. And then we receive his abundance into our very selves. And again, the thanksgiving comes before the reception of the grace, even as a part of that prayer. So this is a model of Eucharist, but Eucharist itself is a model of our entire disposition and attitude toward God. That Jesus is showing us here, not just showing, but pulling us into, which he does here in Bethany and now in every Mass, and preferably every interaction we have with Jesus and his Father. After giving thanks very publicly and vocally, now we see the manifestation of God's glory. Jesus shouts in, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus comes out. This is an interesting thing to think about. The question I'll raise, that I'll preface by saying the text doesn't actually give us the answer, is who raises Lazarus from the dead? Jesus, of course, right? But who is Jesus just credited this miracle to? Jesus hasn't said, "Hey everybody, thank me, I'm so awesome, I've healed this guy." He says, "Thank you, Father, for hearing me." So Jesus, the one doing the asking, but God, the Father, the one doing the healing. And Jesus' role in this being just as one who petitions God in a way that God hears and answers. How we set this up is very important, because this is a foreshadowing of the resurrection of Jesus. We'll talk about it again when we get there, but Jesus also buried in a tomb, also bound up. The key difference here is that when Lazarus comes out, he is still bound, and Jesus leaves his bindings behind. If God raised Lazarus from the dead, just some guy, of course, God can raise Jesus, his son, from the dead. What this does is it actually makes the resurrection of Jesus less special. Bear with me on this, because it's very important for what Jesus is really trying to do, that we understand this. Rising from the dead is not unprecedented. And if Jesus, in human form, was not needed to be a conduit of God's grace to make that happen, if God the Father from heaven could act in this closed tomb and make Lazarus go from dead to not dead, then of course he can act on his son in a similarly closed tomb and make him go from dead to not dead. The resurrection of Jesus is a repetition of the resurrection of Lazarus. So what makes it so special? What makes Jesus' resurrection a thing that is capable of saving all of dead humanity, whereas Lazarus' resurrection is just, there's this guy who's not dead anymore. Not a small thing, but what's the difference? And the difference isn't the dead person not being dead anymore. It's what happens after that. In all of human history, up until Jesus, there has never been a human body that enters heaven. Jesus is different from Lazarus and from all of us in that it's not about lying down or standing up. It's about life and death, but the kind that Lazarus does not have God's divine life in him still, in the way that Jesus means, in the way that humanity was originally created with and intended for. He's not sharing in the divine life of God. Jesus is, so that Jesus, being divine and human, can make humanity something else. He can take a human body and go up to heaven. Think about that. How could we do? Think about the possibility of that. Where would you go? How would you do that? We don't know the way. It was talked about back then as just up. But we've gone up and we haven't found God. We've gone to the sky. We've gone to the moon and we have not found God. Where is this up? It's not actually a geographically located place. It's a spiritually located place that requires a spirit that meets the conditions for going there of life that only Jesus has. But he can take a human body there, a thing that no one else can do. So that what makes Jesus different from Lazarus isn't the resurrection, but it's the ascension. It matters that Jesus goes away and what happens after that. It's after that that the doors are open for all of us. It's his ascension that saves humanity, not his resurrection. Although his resurrection, of course, critical part of how he gets there. His passion, death, and resurrection are necessary also to lead into the ascension. But the resurrection by itself isn't all of what's going on here and all of what makes this important. And how it's symbolically demonstrated is Lazarus is not able to unbind himself. He is, if you think about what it means to really stand up and be free to move, he's not free to move around. He's still tied up. He's still restricted and constrained. That's all of us, right? We're all still, by our sin, bound and constrained. And so it doesn't matter, is my body standing up or laying down? Even if I'm made to stand back up, I am still constrained. I'm not free. And that's all of us. In Lazarus' resurrection, the best that can happen if we're raised back up is we're still bound. We're still constrained. Jesus, on the other hand, gets back up and leaves his bonds behind. After his resurrection, he is no longer bound. His mortal person is not bound or constrained. It's free. And in that freedom, it goes and journeys to God the Father. And a human body enters heaven, enters true paradise. And through that, we all have the ability to share in that entry into paradise. Jesus is going to spend many chapters and a large amount of dialogue trying to explain to us how that works. And it won't be that easy. And could be extremely confusing. But we're going to take a crack at that through much of the rest of this Bible study. For here, it's worth noting the strong parallels and the important key differences between the resurrection of Lazarus and the resurrection of Jesus. Now we come back to the key point that Jesus didn't do this in a vacuum or just with Mary and Martha. But again, he timed when he's there. The 4 days, as we've talked about, was an important element, but another important element was that many of the Jews from Jerusalem were also there as a part of tending to the grief of Mary and Martha. So Jesus had an audience for this particular thing. Think back to the man born blind. He just met this guy on the way with some of his followers, said, did the spit in the clay, spread it on his eyes, sent him away to wash. He wasn't even healed in the presence of Jesus. And there were almost no witnesses to actually see this thing happen. It was all hearsay. And so they brought in the guy and they brought in his parents, and everybody had to get a large number of witnesses an account to try to figure out what happened, because there weren't a lot of eyewitnesses. So you're drawing in and you're trying to figure out what happened from all these sources, and it's ultimately relatively easy to discredit because there aren't a ton of people who saw it. Now, not only does Jesus do something that's arguably a bigger deal, even if it's something that's happened before, whereas restoring sight to someone born blind is not a thing that there's precedent for. That thing never happened. This thing, however, the prophets Elijah and Elisha also raised people from the dead. A little bit more precedented, but also arguably a bigger deal. And you have tons of people who were there, who knew Lazarus was laid in the tomb. Everyone believed definitively that he was dead. There was no question, guy is super dead. And then he's not. And no one is saying it's a fluke, it's a fake. No one is saying anything but Jesus made this dead guy be not dead. And there is such a preponderance of evidence. In this case, there's no questioning, did this really happen? So, Jewish leaders find out that this thing occurred and don't have the ability to question, in this case, whether it really happened. So how do they respond? They, of course, decide this Jesus guy is the real deal and we should follow him and this is God speaking to us. No. Instead, they decide this is a big problem. We need to kill this guy. There are a few things wrong with that. The chief one being they're kind of proving Jesus' point that you're not trying to serve God, or you would recognize this and give glory to God. You're clearly serving your father, the devil. Second one, how do you kill a guy who can make dead people be not dead? They're not thinking it through very well, right? Which we see backfires spectacularly if you think about it, and is a very good thing for us that it happened. But if he can make a dead person be not dead, how are you going to kill him? They still think, while they're recognizing that it's happening, they're still not getting what it means. That this guy, it's not just a thing he does externally, and he didn't even do it. The Father did it at his request. How are you going to kill that guy when the laws of life and death don't apply to him? But they're not thinking that. They're thinking, this is a big problem. If you give them more credit than they deserve, then their key point is he's going to get us all killed. Because he's going to draw bad attention from Rome. And he's a danger to all of us. Again, not thinking it through very well. If you have a guy who can raise people from the dead, doesn't really matter if the Romans come and kill everybody, because they don't have to stay dead. You're not getting it, guys. There's something different here that is not within your frame of reference. If you could look with the eyes of faith, you could see this as something different from what it is. And in fact, the early church, we see, does recognize exactly that. Look at all the people who go willingly to be martyred because they've actually understood after Jesus' resurrection, oh, death is irrelevant when my God can make dead people not dead. Sign me up if that's what it takes to love and serve him. Bring it on. I'm fine. Yeah, turn me over. I'm done on this side, right? St. Lawrence, or whatever various witnesses of the early martyrs who treated death like it was not a big deal. Because they'd come to understand the only big deal is loving and serving God and putting him before everything else. This miracle gives all the Jewish leaders the same opportunity to grasp that prior to Jesus' death and resurrection. Everyone should still be seeing and understanding now that is possible. And if everybody bought into it, then the church and the Jewish people would be the same thing. There's this opportunity for Jerusalem and the Jews to be the church. All they would have to do is see this event and say, yes, God, we see what you're pointing at, we get it, we are going to listen to this Jesus guy and we're going to serve God. And then God's church is here, Jerusalem, right there. But of course, that's not what happens, and Jesus knows that's not what's going to happen. And the mechanism of how all of this works ultimately even requires that Jesus be put to death. So things are at play or in play and in motion here, where the raising of Lazarus leads to the death and raising of Jesus. Less charitably, of course, than giving these guys the benefit of the doubt that they're trying to save the lives of all of the people, because that's not logically consistent with what's happened, is it's extremely threatening their own power and interests, because Jesus is getting very famous from this, and they can't do anything of the sort, and that is a deep challenge to their authority, and so they are trying to kill Jesus. Even more, they already were trying to kill Jesus, now they're even more trying to kill Jesus. And potentially there's even more buy-in to the idea of, we need to kill Jesus. And then last but not least, we frame all of this as, when is it happening? Well, we're moving into another feast, specifically the Passover. And that's also going to be extremely important to where we're going. So Jesus is very much preparing for this particular Passover, and what he's just done here with Lazarus is a part of that. And all these things are in motion, and we'll see over many chapters how it all ultimately plays out. This has been an overview of Lesson 14. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.